Haidong! In this video, we're going to talk about stance focus number 1. Just with our cutting focus video, I'm going to break it down into 3 different major aspects I would like you to focus on as you go through stance focus number 1. Now, stance focus number 1 is associated with form 1. So this is the very first focus that you do. So I guess keep that in mind if you are at least following the Federation guidelines. And this is a really good one for you to teach just as early as you can, just because it works on a lot of different things, and you can also use this at home, right? This is actually a very safe one to do at home if you don't do the actual cutting, but I can show you an alternative version that will also work on that. So the stance focuses are obviously going to be working on our stances, right? But let's take a look at 3 specific aspects I would like you to take a look at. The first one is going to be awareness of where your belt knot is facing. Now it's going to be more of a shortcut for you to be more aware of where your chest is facing and where your legs are facing, all that fun stuff. But just knowing where your belt knot is facing is going to be kind of like a heuristic for you to kind of, again, keep in mind as you go through stances in stance focus number 1, as well as stances in the rest of your forms. Right, so if we're here and we draw, Kenjok, right? So our first one is going to be a nice little kimatse, right? So again, keep in mind where your belt knot is, notice your hips are back, blah, blah, blah. So in, ban. Notice I do not come up, right? Notice I stay about the same level. I stay where my knees are. So it's here, ban, right? So I'm going to turn to my left. In general, like a good rule of thumb is usually go to your left first in Gumdo. So from here, you're going to turn, bomse, right? So bomse is a really nice one. So again, notice where your belt knot's facing. You're trying to make it as forward as possible. So you can be here, right? And one thing to keep in mind, so one side note is you might notice my bomse might be a little bit different from the way you might be learning it, but the way I'm doing it this way is the most effective for me, so just keep that in mind. But here, right, ban, notice where your belt knot's facing, right? And as you shift to the other side, ban, right, belt knot, notice where it's going, right? And so it's like, ban, forward, right? So keep that in mind as you go through, because that's going to be a good way for you to keep in mind, again, where your chest is facing. Again, in general, you want your belt knot or your chest facing the person you're trying to cut. Actually, let's talk about why that's true, because I spent a few minutes being like, yeah, that's true, like why is that true? So let's talk about why that's true, right? So for example, there are times I do not cut on center. So for example, if I'm doing an uppercut, it's usually a lot more effective for me to go off to the side here, my target's here, and for me to blow him out with an uppercut, right? But the main reason I like to have my belt knot facing the direction I'm facing someone is for kinesiological reasons, right? So, for example, if I'm doing a center cut, straight on, fine, like my hands are equal and opposite, right? Again, my left hand's a little bit closer, so it's not exactly equal and opposite, but it's as equal and opposite as I can make it. But notice, so I'm going to go the weird way first, and what most people do. What if I kind of twist my belt knot this way? This is going to be really weird. I'm going to twist it this way. I'm definitely not balanced, right? And I notice I have to shift it back to normal just for me to stay balanced. So if I do twist this way, I'm going to put more emphasis on my left hand reaching out, and my right hand is kind of like dangling to keep up. Likewise, if I'm here, right? So keep in mind, some masters, and this is technically canonical, some masters do have their hips a little bit more back, their hearts more back, that's the reason. So their belt knot's a little bit more on an angle this way. So that might seem weird, or that might seem okay the first time around, because we're right hand dominant in general. So I can just cut this way, right? Seems fine, right? But the idea is the left hand should be my powerhouse. I should have that in a position where it can actually generate power. Here I can't. Here I can, right? So from a kinesiological perspective, just having equal and opposite is going to have less strain on the smaller muscle groups. It's also just going to be easier for your body to compensate, right? You can use the bigger muscle groups because everything's in line with the direction I'm going, as opposed to if I'm trying to twist and do weird things, it's not going to be as effective, and in fact it might damage your body. So a side note on that, so I didn't mention my bomse, so there is one reason I do my particular bomse as opposed to the various different ways that I've been kind of like swimming around, and this is kind of the one that I've settled on, is because this is the one that damages me the least. So notice, so again, if your master says otherwise, do what your master says. Don't do what some random person on YouTube says. Right, so notice my knee is actually facing my direct forward, right? So I'm directly facing this way, my back foot's about on the 45-degree, everything's facing forward here, it's stretching my back of my knee, but I feel my larger muscle groups activating. As opposed to if you do what, again, is technically also canonical, and I twist my knee in a little bit, notice everything shifts to the back foot. I feel some strain on the inside of my thigh. It's not as strong for me. So, if I'm using this stance as a evasion, which is the usual purpose of this, this is going to get my knee out of the way. It's also going to be locked more, so it's going to be able to withstand more damage, as opposed to if it's bent softly and twisted. If I get hit there, in fact, actually that's exposing the good part of my knee to my opponent a little bit more easily, versus this is more locked. It's easier on my body, but that's kind of a side note on just make sure your belt knot's facing the same direction as you're moving and as you're cutting, unless if that's intentional. A second thing you can focus on as you go through the stances is, and this is going to be more as a learning exercise more than anything else, is learn the terminology, right? So one thing that we do sometimes here, just to make sure everyone remembers the terminology, is for your ki, shout the name of the stance. Now that's going to get exceedingly annoying if you do this every single time. In fact, I think I did mention this in the past, right? I think in fact as we went through basics, right? So for example, you're going to like, for Eya, just because you're introducing, and then Kimase, Bomse, Bomse, Sodase. Right, that's probably going to get really, really annoying, but this is one way for you to cement it into your brain. This is also going to be true for the second part when you do Gongai Dong Yep Pao Songse, Gongai Dong Yep Pao Songse, Teidose, Bokose, all that fun stuff, right? But this is just like fun, baby fun. Just another thing you can focus on as you're going through your stance focus. The third aspect that I'd like you to focus on, and this is something that I could gush on for like hours on end, just because it's something that I find really sort of interesting, and also is just a really good thing for people to focus on, is going to be the hip, center, and movement portion. So what I would like to do, right, so obviously if you keep on saying, Eya! Right? So if you're here, notice what your hips are doing. My hips are back, my center of mass, almost like I'm kind of curled around my center of mass, right? I'm here. And as you move and as you shift your weight, right? So shifting the weight between your glutes. That might sound weird, but it's true, right? So in kimase, they're equal, right? And then kimase, as I shift back, notice it's going to shift into one glute more than the other as I shift my center of mass in this way, right? So as I move it in, cut, right? So notice, again, belt knot, but also my hips are back. Why? Because I'm evading a crosscut that's really annoying to block. So I'm evading back. I can move more forward. My hips, my shoulders are forward enough so I can stab someone in the face if I need to. Probably not because it's going to be that strong. But I'm in a position where I can still cut you while I am safe, right? So notice as I shift that way, I'm going to move this way, right? Obviously with a sword, but here, bun, right? I'm going to be shifting back, hips back, center of mass here as I cut down. So to say, so shift my glute weight, so my glute from here to here as I shift and then come in, right? And we can do that for all of the stances, all of the stance focuses. That's something that I really like to work on. But this is something you can also work on at home without a sword. So this particular drill is one that I really, really, really like to do. I in fact do this a lot with my other forms if I'm doing it without a sword. Now it's going to look weird, you may not feel the pressure, but this is a really, really, really good way for, if you're aware of how to manipulate pressure, this is an awesome way to train with it. So for example, again, it's going to look weird, right? I think I freak out my cats when I do this. But we're here, right? So what we're going to do is cut down and then bah, right? So it's also very similar to our meditation, right? That was fast forward. But here, feel your core activate as you push your hips back. This is kimase, going that way. So I want to shift my weight back this way. So what I'm going to do is actually use my right hand, push back here. It's like I'm pushing in, right? As I sink down, right? So you don't have to do anything with this, just weird for me, but so push, right? So as I kind of feel the energy, if you want to think of it that way, pressure, right? Center of mass, all that fun stuff, pushing in, right? Sink, right? So this should not be a lazy stance. I should be active in this. I should feel, again, the energy, again, if you want to be using the terminology, using the energy to push the energy forward where my belt knot's facing that way. As I shift this way, it's not, right? You feel like all the energy just suddenly drop. Versus here, so push. As I'm going this way, I'm going to use this hand, almost like I'm gathering it up, and then push. I can feel it, bang, right? And sink down. Same thing going that way. I'm going to do this so you can stay in camera, but here, as I'm shifting that way, I'm going to push everything this way, shift the weight between my glutes, here, bang, bang, right? So you can sink down, feel it in. And then, again, just to stay in camera, going that way. I'm going to shift in and feel that power and just push, right? So feel it. And once again, going forward without kimase, and up. So this is a really, really good drill that I would highly recommend, not just in your stance focus, but also going to be in your forms. At this point, I'd also like to note that focus on your breathing, right? So I was kind of talking as I did this, so I'm a little bit winded, but this is also a good time for you to think about your ki, right? So for example, it would be really weird if you were focusing on the so really feeling the air. It was like, yeah, right? Just to kind of show how ridiculous that is, I'm going to try to give you the same power with the weird kind of, childish ki, right? Yeah! Even said it. It's weird, right? Versus, very different, right? So keep that in mind as you go through these portions of your stance focus. As with the previous video, go through those 3 aspects for yourself as you go through your stance focus. Not just one. If you want to go through 1, 2, and 3, or 4, 5, and 6 for that matter, doing all these concepts, they're going to help, right? So again, keep in mind where your belt knot's facing, keep in mind the terminology, and then try to notice where your hips and your center of mass is. If you want to do it all open-handed and kind of like manipulate the pressure around you. Again, that sounds crazy, but this would be an excellent way for you to train with that. But with that, I want you to stay safe, keep training, and stay humble. Haidong!